They say you ought to forgive and forget in life, and things will be a lot easier. I don't fully agree with that. But I'd like to delve into the nature of forgiveness before we even talk about forgetting. Forgiveness is a powerful act. It is an incredibly powerful act, and it's something crucial to the Christian belief. Because in order to forgive somebody, there ought to be a crime with a lot of weight associated to it. And that weight itself oftentimes underscores what you are trying to forgive and how much you have to push yourself in order to forgive somebody. Because of course, if somebody took a bottle of water from my home and then asked for forgiveness, oh, that's easy, right? If someone were to take the life of a family member, I would have to have a lot of time to process that before I could even get to the point of forgiveness. Now, we ought to forgive, but there ought to also be a time to process the weight that's placed upon the forgiveness in order that for that forgiveness to be sincere. There's a saint, Saint Maria Goretti. She was a young girl in Italy, and forgive me if I tell the story incorrectly. I'm doing this off of memory. She was very poor, and in her household was another family with a young boy, a young man who lived there as well. And he was a troubled young man. And one day when Saint Maria Goretti, she was home tending to some chores, and her sister was asleep in the room, that young man decided that he wanted to ask her out. Saint Maria Goretti said, no, I'd rather not. And then he forced himself upon her, and when she refused him for purity reasons, he stabbed her, I think 20 some times. And in the hospital, as she was dying, she said she forgave the young man. And the young man went to prison, and he saw Saint Maria Goretti in a few appearances. But what really struck me interesting in this story is that later on in life, the young man ended up going to Maria's mother, and after multiple decades, she forgave him. And he went on to serve as I believe he went on to serve as a monk. Now, the forgiveness that Saint Maria Goretti had, of course, is very powerful. She forgave him on her deathbed. But her mother, she took decades, I believe 50, 60 years in order to forgive him. And the weight of that underscores how big of a deal that forgiveness was. And so if we ought to forgive somebody, the weight has to be tagged upon, the weight of the crime has to be considered in order to talk about how great the act of forgiveness is. So now let's talk about forget. If the weight of the crime is so great, should you forget it? Absolutely not. I think the grace of forgiveness and the act of forgiveness is something so strong because of the crime associated to it. And just like you ought to have some regrets in life, not a whole lot of regrets. If you have a whole lot of regrets in life, something's to be said about perhaps reconsidering your decision-making skills. But to forget somebody's crime is to then completely negate the weight of the forgiveness and the crime alike. And I think this act of forgiveness, why it says so much about humanity is precisely because you are able to consider the weight of the crime to levy it out. So to forget that is to negate the importance of that forgiveness. But it is highly important to get to the point to where you can forgive somebody. Boomstick. So there were some certain inaccuracies when I was on range because, of course, I was shooting from the hip with the historical facts of Saint Maria Goretti. And we can't have any of that. This is also a good point to remind that this is, or when my Protestant brethren are saying that we are worshipping these people and Mother Mary as saints, and we should not be doing that because that is a sin. This is veneration. Veneration is celebrating a saint's life and celebrating why are they saints? They are saints because these are examples for us to follow. So, in this particular example, Maria Goretti is widely attributed to the act of forgiveness. That's why I thought of her. And forgive me, I've got some data rolling on the side so I wouldn't get the wrong thing. So she was actually born in 1890, and unlike many other saints, we actually have an image of her. And she died in 1902, so she wasn't very old. The boy was there because, let me rewind, her father had died from malaria, and her mother was a sole provider for the household. And so they were very poor, and this one day she was sewing a shirt and basically focusing on sewing a shirt while her sister Teresa was sick and in the bedroom asleep. And Alessandro, which was the young man, came by and he took a liking to her. And he didn't, as I previously said, gentlemanly ask her out as a gentleman, but he tried to rape her. He tried to force himself upon her. And Saint Maria Goretti fought back, said no, said that this is a sin and God does not permit it. God does not want it. At this point, because she was fighting back, Alessandro got really, really upset and pulled out a knife and stabbed her 11 times. Now, it was her sister who heard the scuffling and ran out and chased him off, but she was laid on the ground bleeding out, and they got her to the hospital. And the surgeon, what's to be said is the surgeon, when he was in the hospital, asked her to think of him when she was in paradise. And she laid on the table saying, well, who knows who's going to go first? Which then the surgeon replied, you, Maria. And then she said, then I'll gladly think of you. Because she didn't realize how badly she was hurt at that moment. But before she died, she did say that she forgave Alessandro and that she wanted to see him in heaven with her as well. So Alessandro, he was not repentant. He did not think that he did anything wrong, even when he was serving his time out. It wasn't until he dreamed one day and saw Maria, and Maria in the dream had said that she had forgiven him and gave him a white lily, that he woke up repentant and wanting to repent for his wrongdoings. And now, this is one of the errors that I had. When Maria, or when Alessandro came out, was 27 years later. He went directly to Maria's mother and begged her forgiveness, which she said, if my daughter can forgive him, who am I to withhold forgiveness? And later on in 1947, Maria Goretti was beatified by Pope Pius XII. And then in 1950, she was declared a saint. Now, here's the interesting thing. Alessandro was still alive, and he was actually in the crowd to celebrate her. And I got this wrong. He didn't become a monk. He was a lay brother of the order of Friars Minor Capuchin. And he worked as a receptionist and a gardener until his death. And he died He died at 87, so he got to live for quite a bit longer past that. Now, this is a story of forgiveness that is widely retold in the Catholic Church. And it wasn't just talking about the act of forgiveness, but also what happens after forgiveness. Alessandro came to the light and became someone who Maria could see him in paradise. Now, what I was primarily trying to talk about, forgiveness, I think could be misconstrued to where I think you have to have a certain amount of time to forgive someone. And I thought back, and that's really not it. A lot of this is having the courage to not just face somebody who's wronged you, but face yourself and being able to give someone the forgiveness itself. Now, the other question is, if someone is repentant or not, does that drive whether you want to forgive them or not? I think the answer here is, it doesn't matter if someone is repentant or not. You ought to think about forgiving someone, because the act of forgiveness is less so about the other person hearing it. A lot of that is from you being able to let go of that and still pray or wish for the well-being of another human being. I've heard people say it more and more often the last few years that we hate the sin, not the sinner. So we want to dislike the act of someone wronging you and less so the person, because of course we want them to become a better person. And so circling back, if some people were to say forgive and forget, if you were to forget the actual crime itself, the severity of that crime directly underpins how amazing or the value of that forgiveness itself. And so you would then take away from the amazing act of forgiveness if you were to forget the crime. So I disagree with that comment, because I think the crime and the act of forgiveness are, the two of those are linked together. Not that you need a certain amount of time to forgive someone. Hope you guys have a good day.